December 7, 1941. The world changed in a heartbeat. But amidst the smoke and oil fires of Pearl Harbor, a terrifying realization was dawning on the few American pilots who managed to get airborne. They were not just outnumbered, they were severely outclassed. For years, Western intelligence had dismissed Japanese aviation. They believed the aircraft were inferior copies of European designs, flown by pilots who lacked the skill of their Western counterparts. They were wrong, dead wrong. From the smoke of the early Pacific battles emerged a silhouette that would haunt the nightmares of every Allied aviator, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. It was not just a machine, it was a phantom. Painted a pale, ghostly gray or olive drab, it moved through the Pacific skies with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It was faster, climbed steeper, and turned tighter than anything the United States Navy could put in the air. To a pilot in a Grumman F6F Wildcat, seeing a zero on your tail was not just a tactical disadvantage, it was often a death sentence. The disparity was agonizing. The American Wildcat was a tub of a plane, rugged, heavy, built like a tank, but sluggish. The Zero, by comparison, was a feather. Japanese engineers had sacrificed armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks to shave off every ounce of weight. The result was a fighter that responded to the lightest touch. In a dogfight, a Zero could complete a full turn and be on a Wildcat's tail before the American pilot had even finished his first bank. It was like fighting a samurai sword with a baseball bat. Throughout early 1942, the reports coming back to Washington were grim. From the Philippines to the Coral Sea, the Zero reigned supreme. It possessed a range that stunned Allied planners, appearing over targets thought to be safely out of reach. It carried two 20mm cannons that tore through American aluminum like paper. But its greatest weapon was psychological. The Zero myth began to infect the minds of the sailors and airmen. It was the boogeyman of the Pacific. Whispers spread through the mess halls and barracks of an invincible machine, a super fighter that could not be beaten in a dogfight. New pilots arrived in the theater already shaken, believing they were facing a supernatural enemy. The tactical mandate from U.S. commanders was humiliating but necessary. Never dogfight a Zero. It was an admission of inferiority. If an American pilot saw a Zero, the orders were to make one diving pass and run for their lives. If they tried to turn and fight, they died. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of the war in China, were masters of their craft. They knew their machine was fragile, that a few good hits could turn it into a fireball, but it didn't matter because they were untouchable. They danced around the lumbering American formations, picking them off one by one with surgical precision. The United States was losing the air war. The Wildcat pilots, as brave as they were holding the line with grit and prayer. But grit doesn't stop a 20mm shell. The Navy engineers at Grumman were working furiously on a successor, a new fighter that could match this monster. But they were designing in the dark. They didn't know the Zero's secret. They didn't know its stall speed, its engine limits, or its hidden weaknesses. They were guessing. To break the myth of invincibility, they didn't just need a better plane, they needed a miracle. They needed to look under the hood of the devil himself. And in the summer of 1942, amidst the frozen fog of the Aleutian Islands, destiny was about to hand them the key.
June 4, 1942. While the bulk of the Japanese Imperial Navy was steaming toward its date with destiny at Midway, a diversionary force was striking north, attacking the remote American outpost of Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. Among the swarm of attackers was a 19-year-old flight petty officer named Tadayoshi Koga. He flew the crown jewel of Japanese aviation, a Mitsubishi A6M Zero, tail number 4593. He had no way of knowing that his specific aircraft was about to become the most valuable prize of the entire Pacific War. The raid was chaotic. Smoke billowed from the fuel tanks of Dutch Harbor, staining the gray Alaskan sky. During a strafing run on American flying boats anchored in the bay, ground fire erupted from the shore. It was mostly small arms fire, insignificant against a warship, but deadly to the fragile Zero. A single .50 caliber bullet pierced the underside of Koga's fuselage. It severed the oil return line. It was a small wound, but fatal to the machine. As Koga pulled up and away, a thick trail of black oil began to streak the sky behind him. The heart of his engine was bleeding out. Koga knew he couldn't make it back to the carrier Ryujo. The engine would seize long before he reached the fleet. But the Japanese had prepared for this. They had designated a small, desolate volcanic island called Akutan as an emergency landing site. Koga radioed his wingmen. He reduced his airspeed to save the engine and limped toward the island. His wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Endo and Petty Officer Shikata, escorted him, watching anxiously as the oil pressure gauge in Koga's cockpit dropped to 0. As they approached Akutan, the island looked like salvation. A broad, flat, grassy valley lay between the volcanic peaks. From the air, it looked like a perfect, solid meadow, a natural runway waiting for him. Koga lowered his landing gear. He approached smoothly, a textbook emergency landing. But the landscape was a trap. The solid grass was actually muskeg, a deep waterlogged bog of mud and vegetation peculiar to the Aleutians. The moment Koga's main wheels touched the ground, they didn't roll, they sank. The sudden deceleration was violent. The landing gear caught in the thick mud, and the Zero flipped instantly onto its back, slamming the canopy into the sludge. The impact snapped Tadayoshi Koga's neck, killing him instantly. His wingmen circled overhead, horrified. Their standing orders were clear: destroy any downed Zero to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. They were supposed to strafe the wreckage until it burned, but they couldn't do it. They couldn't bring themselves to shoot at the plane of their friend, unsure if he was still alive inside. They circled once, twice, and then turned back toward the fleet, leaving the plane intact. They assumed the harsh Alaskan elements would swallow the wreckage. They were wrong. For 5 weeks, the Zero lay upside down in the silence of the bog, preserved by the cold mud. Then, on July 10th, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina pilot named Lieutenant Bill Thies was patrolling the area. He had gone off course due to a navigational error. Looking down, he saw something that didn't belong in the empty wilderness: the distinct rising sun insignia on a pair of wings. The recovery operation was a logistical nightmare. The Americans realized immediately what they had found. This wasn't a twisted wreck, it was a nearly perfect specimen. A team was dispatched to the remote island. They had to battle freezing rain, mosquitoes, and the treacherous mud that had killed Koga. They built a skid and used a tractor to drag the delicate aircraft miles to the shore, treating it with the care of a newborn baby. The Akutan Zero, as it came to be called, was crated up and shipped south to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. It was a ghost brought back to life. When the crate was opened, Allied engineers stared in awe. Here, finally, was the dragon they had been fighting in the dark. The myth was sitting on their hangar floor. They cleaned the mud from the engine, straightened the vertical stabilizer, and painted American stars over the Japanese roundels. They didn't just want to look at it. They were going to fly it. They were going to ask the machine its secrets. And for the first time in the war, the Zero was going to answer. The gift from the Aleutians was about to expose the fatal flaw in the Japanese armor, and the result would be a slaughter.
September 20th, 1942. The runway at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego shimmered in the heat. Sitting on the tarmac was a ghost. It had been pulled from an Alaskan swamp, cleaned of mud, patched up by mechanics working around the clock, and repainted with the white star and blue circle of the U.S. Navy. But the silhouette was unmistakable. It was the Akutan Zero. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders walked around the aircraft. There was no flight manual. There were no safety protocols. He was about to strap himself into a machine built by the enemy, a machine that had killed hundreds of his countrymen, and take it into the sky. The risk was enormous. If a cable snapped or the engine seized, the intelligence coup of the century would end in a fireball on the California coast. But the need for answers was greater than the fear of death. Sanders climbed into the cockpit. It was tight, cramped, and smelled of foreign oil and metal. He fired the engine. The 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai roared to life, a sound that usually sent Allied sailors scrambling for their battle stations. Sanders taxied out and pushed the throttle forward. The plane didn't just take off, it leaped. He was airborne in less than half the distance required for a Grumman Wildcat. In the air, Sanders immediately understood the terror of the Pacific pilots. The Zero was exquisite. It handled like a fine sports car, responding to the slightest twitch of the wrist. At slow speeds, it was a ballerina. Sanders pulled back on the stick and performed loops and turns so tight they made his head spin. He realized that no American plane could ever hope to turn inside a Zero in a classic dogfight. To try was suicide. But Sanders wasn't there to admire the engineering. He was there to break it. He was there to find the glass jaw. He climbed to 15,000 feet and began to push the aircraft to its limits. He leveled off and slammed the throttle forward, watching the airspeed indicator climb. 200 knots, 250 knots, and then something strange happened. The ballerina turned into a brick. As the speed increased, the massive ailerons, the control surfaces on the wings that make the plane roll, became incredibly heavy. The aerodynamic pressure was too much for the cables. Sanders had to use all his strength just to bank the plane. He discovered that above 200 knots, the Zero lost its agility. It could fly fast, but it couldn't fight fast. Then came the second discovery. Sanders put the plane into a sudden, steep dive, shoving the stick forward. The engine sputtered and coughed. The Zero was equipped with an old-fashioned float-type carburetor. Under negative G-forces, the float would rise, cutting off the fuel flow to the engine. The engine would die for a few critical seconds before catching again. The American planes, with their fuel injection systems, didn't have this problem. They could bunt over into a dive instantly. Finally, Sanders looked at the airframe itself. It was built for speed and range, but the cost was horrific. There was no armor plate behind the pilot's seat. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing. They were essentially aluminum cans filled with high-octane gasoline integrated directly into the wings. Back on the ground, the data was compiled into a revelation. The monster wasn't invincible. It was a fragile, high-speed tinderbox with stiff controls. Eddie Sanders had found the formula to kill it. The report went out to the fleet. Do not dogfight at slow speeds. If a Zero is on your tail, do not try to outturn him. Instead, go full throttle. Dive hard. The Zero's engine will cut out and he won't be able to follow. Once you are fast, roll to the right. The Zero's torque makes it sluggish in a right-hand roll. Use your weight. Use your armor. Slash at him from high speed, then run. The mystery was gone. The Zero was no longer a supernatural phantom. It was just a machine with a fatal design flaw. Eddie Sanders had exposed the glass jaw, and now the U.S. Navy was getting ready to throw the knockout punch.
The era of the Zero's dominance ended that afternoon over San Diego. In Bethpage, New York, 3,000 miles away from the Pacific front lines, the factory floor of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation was vibrating with the sound of rivet guns. They called this place the Iron Works. The philosophy here was simple: build them strong, build them safe, and build them to bring the pilot home. While the Japanese had been building the Zero, a delicate, elegant sword of a plane, Grumman was busy forging a sledgehammer. They called it the F6F the Hellcat. The Hellcat was already in development before the Akutan Zero was found, but the intelligence gathered by Eddie Sanders acted as the final critical catalyst. When the reports from San Diego arrived at the Grumman offices, they didn't just confirm the design, they turned the engineering team into prophets. The data revealed that the Zero was a lightweight master of the slow-speed dogfight, but it had a glass jaw at high speeds and high altitudes. The engineers looked at their blueprints for the Hellcat and realized they had accidentally built the perfect anti-Zero. The heart of the Hellcat was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. It was a massive 18-cylinder radio beast that pumped out 2,000 horsepower. The Zero only had 1,130. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a mismatch. The Akutan data proved that the Zero's controls stiffened up at 200 knots. Grumman engineers ensured the Hellcat was designed with large, hydraulically boosted ailerons that allowed it to roll and turn violently even at 300 or 400 knots. Where the Zero became a brick, the Hellcat remained a predator. The report stated the Zero lacked armor. Grumman doubled down on protection. The Hellcat was built like a flying tank. It had 212 pounds of armor plating around the cockpit to stop the 20-millimeter cannon shells that had shredded the Wildcats. It had self-sealing fuel tanks and bulletproof glass. Japanese pilots would later report with horror that they would empty their magazines into a Hellcat, seeing pieces fly off, only for the American plane to simply keep flying. But the most crucial engineering feat was the wing. The Zero was designed for lift and turning. The Hellcat's square-tipped wings were designed for the boom and zoom. Based on Sanders' discovery that the Zero's engine cut out in a dive, the Hellcat was optimized to drop from the sky like a stone. It could dictate the terms of the battle. If a Hellcat pilot found himself in a bad spot, he could simply point the nose down and hit the throttle. The Zero could not follow. The cockpit was moved higher, giving the pilot a humpback view, allowing him to see over the nose during carrier landings and, more importantly, to spot the enemy first. 6 .50 caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings, carrying enough ammunition to saw a Japanese plane in half. This was no longer a fair fight. The engineering team at Grumman, armed with the stolen secrets of the Akutan Zero, had mathematically eliminated the enemy's advantages. They hadn't just built a new plane, they had built a specific countermeasure. By the time the first Hellcats reached the carriers in the Pacific, the pilots weren't just stepping into a new cockpit, they were stepping into a machine that had been scientifically calibrated to kill the exact enemy they were facing. The fear of the invincible Zero was replaced by the cold confidence of horsepower and steel. The Hellcat was heavy, it was wide, and it wasn't particularly pretty, but it was fast, it was indestructible, and it was hungry. The engineers had done their job. Now it was time for the pilots to finish the war. By late 1943, the balance of power in the Pacific did not just shift, it shattered. The arrival of the F6F Hellcat on the decks of the new Essex-class carriers marked the end of the Zero myth. The Japanese pilots, many of whom were now inexperienced rookies replacing the veterans lost at Midway and Guadalcanal, looked out of their cockpits and saw a nightmare. The American planes were no longer the sluggish Wildcats they had hunted for sport. These new machines were bigger, faster, and terrifyingly aggressive. The tactical doctrine developed from Eddie Sanders' test flights of the Akutan Zero was now standard operating procedure for every Navy pilot. The rules were simple: climb high, dive fast, and never turn. When a Hellcat pilot saw a Zero, he didn't feel the old cold dread, he felt the surge of 2,000 horsepower. He knew that his enemy had a glass jaw. The result was not a battle, it was an execution. American pilots would spot a formation of Zeros below them. They would roll over and dive, screaming down at speeds the fragile Japanese planes could not match. They would unleash a torrent of .50 caliber fire, shredding the unarmored Zeros into fireballs, and then use the momentum to zoom back up into the safety of the altitude, ready to strike again. The Japanese pilots tried to counter with their acrobatic turns, but the Hellcats simply refused to play that game. They dictated every engagement. The climax of this new reality came on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese threw everything they had left at the U.S. fleet, hundreds of aircraft in a desperate attempt to stop the invasion of Saipan. It should have been a massive, chaotic dogfight. Instead, it became known in history books by a grimly casual nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. As the waves of Japanese bombers and fighters approached, they were met by a solid wall of Hellcats. The American pilots, guided by superior radar and flying the machine built to kill Zeros, tore through the enemy formations. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces, shot down 9 enemy planes in a single mission. Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu shot down 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes, famously grinning for the cameras later as he held up 6 fingers. The sky rained aluminum and burning gasoline. Japanese planes were falling so fast that observers on the ships below lost count. By the end of the day, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost over 300 aircraft. The Americans lost fewer than 30. One pilot, landing on the carrier Lexington, was heard shouting, "Hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The statistics at the end of the war told a story of absolute crushing dominance. The F6F Hellcat was credited with destroying 5,163 enemy aircraft. Its own losses in aerial combat were only 270. This produced a kill ratio of 19-1. For every 1 Hellcat shot down, 19 Japanese planes were destroyed. It was a level of supremacy never seen before or since in the history of aerial warfare. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, had been reduced to a target. The Hellcat had stripped away its mystique, exposed its weaknesses, and ruthlessly exploited them. And while the pilots and the engineers deserved the glory, the ghost in the machine was always there. The victory was built on the muddy grave of Akutan Island. Because one test pilot dared to fly a dead man's plane, the Hellcat became the sword that cut the Japanese Empire from the sky. The 19-1 ratio wasn't just a number, it was the mathematical proof that knowledge is the deadliest weapon of all.